Our main topic this week here on Mastering Dungeons is the DMG Chapter 3, Part 2, Creating Adventures. Last time we talked about the first part of Chapter 3, talking about the elements of great adventures, published adventures, adventure structure. We started by talking about the first adventure type, which is a location-driven adventure type, where your dungeon crawl, if you will. There are locations, and the players go to those different locations and do different things. Next, the next adventure type is an event-based adventure. And an event-based adventure, the focus is on what the characters and villains do and what happens as a result. So what did you think about this, Teos?
It's an 8-step process, starting with a villain, determining what the villain's actions are, determining the party's goals, going through NPCs, anticipating reactions, some locations, and then an introduction and a climax, and you work encounters around that. And all of it is very villain based. And the first thing I thought of is, wow, these are really limited examples. And there's like a table of like event-based villain actions, and I'm just like, wow, when I think of event-based type things I've done, they don't often even include villains. They're like things like survival, or get to the place and time, and then a random person entity will show up, and you have to overcome them or convince them or whatever, but it's not necessarily a clear villain. I thought this had a very focused lens applied to it that I didn't think was a good idea.
When I read it, I thought the same thing you thought. I thought, did someone who wrote this just take an event-based adventure and copy the steps for that particular adventure? And it works for that adventure, but it doesn't work for other types of event-based adventures. And event-based adventures are terribly difficult to write because they rely on timing. And as a game master, you are somewhat beholden to the players on timing. So if you take the situation where there is a succubus that is wreaking havoc in a city, and the characters arrive at the city, maybe they were lured there by rumors of something happening, and the succubus is behind it, but they don't know that. So they get there, they maybe go to a crime scene and see something that the succubus did. They gather clues, and those clues are supposed to lead them somewhere. But it's an event-based thing, so they can't get the next set of clues until an event happens. And what will most players do? They want to act. They don't want to wait. So
Mm-hmm.
they take every single clue that you've given them and they track them down to their logical conclusions. And then when they run out of those clues, they start making up clues. Well, maybe that the iron mug that the person had, maybe that ties back to this tavern. Are there taverns are there taverns in the area? And as the DM, you don't want to say no, because there are taverns in a city. But if you say yes, they're going to go to these taverns and try to find why
Yeah.
this person had this particular mug. And in the meantime, 7 hours of game time have passed, and you're still only 2 hours into in game time, uh, and the event is still 6 hours away from happening. That's going to actually lead them. So it's very, very tough to write, very, very tough to DM these sorts of adventures, and that's what I want to see in this, you
Yeah.
know, in
Again,
this
there's
part
very
of the
little advice on how to take this apart or put it together, and very little counseling of the dangers of it. The other thing is calling an
book.
adventure type, like location or event. I think that does a
Mhm.
disservice to the reality of it. I was trying to think, what is a D&D 5th edition event-based adventure? They like all have lots of locations. There are events in them, and I can think of even like classic
Mhm.
adventures that have events in them, but I really don't think of something as being solely event based. And so that with this dichotomy they've created, this binary location event, it's almost like that's an
Mhm.
encounter discussion or a plot
Mhm.
segment that can be thought of that way.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's true. Uh, right, because I'm thinking back to Rime of the Frost Maiden. Now there are events that happen that could happen at
Mm-hmm.
different locations, maybe,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not. What's more important, as you just say, is the encounter that sets these things up. What information is provided, whether
Yeah.
the encounter is a location or the encounter is an event. You may have different elements that go into those encounters. They may lead to different things, but it's more important to focus on the encounter than whether it's an event or a location.
Yeah, and that it's really this guy that starts off the conversation of what of this event versus location based. Third edition DMG is where this intersects or interjects itself. Suddenly becomes a thing of like talking about events, and it's very similar to the material that's in the 5e DMG. And yeah, again, it's one of those things that I would tear this apart and say, what are we trying to do here? And I think what D&D keeps trying to do is say we can have open play. And then it's like,
Mhm.
how? I don't know. Oh, use an event-based structure, but like I think it's more like that understanding that yeah, sometimes you're just exploring the dungeon and it's definitely about that kind of going through. That is an important mode of play. But also that there are all these other ways that things can be happening. And how do you approach that story-wise? And then how do you back it up in your creations, in your mechanics, in the structure of what you're creating as an adventure or a segment of your adventure. And that's kind of not really super here that I think also or in
Mhm.
the older editions, which I think causes it to fall a little flat here.
Mhm. Yeah, I would have rather seen a deeper discussion, and maybe there is one later about sort of hex crawl versus
Hmm.
linear adventures.
Yeah.
Then you can get into elements of, do you want what the characters encounter to be a location or an event? If it's a location, this is how you play it out. If it's an event, this is things you need to think about,
Yeah.
rather than trying to call an adventure itself location or event based.
Yeah, and I think going through this 8-step process, exactly what you're saying, causes you to almost be off track because you're now trying to create an entire adventure that somehow focuses about this. When really what it can be is what is the story that makes sense in your head? And hey, by the way, don't forget that sometimes it's cool to think about what the villain is doing, or think
Mm-hmm.
about events that can
Right.
happen, whether they're villain driven events or they're natural things, right? The
Mm-hmm.
storm comes, the drought hits, the whatever, right? Like these kinds of things that create neat things that you respond to that aren't just delving into a location, right? And here's how to make those things good and here's
Yeah.
how to worry about them. But and there are, of course, like in this next section that talks about mysteries, there are times when you're crafting something that really drives itself towards being event driven because that's the control of the pacing. You're in the city and you may go to various locations, but you go to those locations because you're unraveling the clues of this mystery. How do
Mm-hmm.
you do that, right? And that I think it's
Right.
somehow this doesn't. I'd be surprised if a new DM read that section and or these sections of events and mysteries and said, "Oh yeah, I'm totally doing this. I know how to do it."
Yeah. Yeah. It's good advice in general, but it's not serviceable advice
Hmm.
when you actually sit down to try to do steps 1 through 8.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
We get this.
and as Teos mentioned, we get
Hmm.
mysteries. Uh, they call it event based, often around a crime. They say it's harder to predict the character's actions in mysteries, as I mentioned earlier. Uh, you're supposed to follow the event based steps, plus add 3 others. Who's the victim? Who are the suspects? And what are the clues?
Yeah, and there's some good advice in here.
You've written
Too many
mysteries.
clues. Yeah, I imagine you have as well. Uh,
I want to
so
hear about yours.
I don't think there was any guide that helped me. I think that what I did is I looked at people who'd done it well, and I thought about that, right? So, like, one I'd say is in Dungeon 205, Infernal Wrath, written by Logan Bonner. He does a great job of what you would call events. Like, this is an event-based thing. He says every day there's enough time to do two things. So the players get to choose what those two things are to investigate, and you've got the whole town there. And in the evening, someone's going to die, and that will lead to new things to investigate, right? Plus, clues will lead to new things to investigate, and so it's going to start moving forward. And at the end, your players will have gathered enough clues to finally stop some murders and address the situation. And depending how good a job it is, they'll see the truth within the truth, and that's really cool, right? And when I did mine, I based it on the game of Clue, and I thought to myself, this is a really fun idea. You know, who did it? With what weapon? I didn't care about where. The where you knew, but that became a very simple thing, right? In order to get in order to get to accomplish your goal, you must figure out who did it with what weapon. And the fun part of it is that ghosts are taking you, are possessing you, and so you sometimes, one of you may end up actually being the murderer, and that makes it a mystery fun as well. And so that kind of situation was a nice framework, right? I thought myself a framework and use that to tell the story. But I don't know that, you know, any of this information would have helped me.
Right. Yeah. Because you also have to always bear in mind what the players will do. And as this admits, it's hard to predict character actions.
Yeah.
And you, just like you don't want to take agency away in a regular adventure, you don't want to take agency away as much as possible in any sort of adventure, including a mystery. And that's why it's you know, Logan's adventure puts that artificial limit on you can do two things. Yeah. And even though it might only take you 20 minutes to do those two things, in order for the adventure to work, we have to make that assumption, which some people are fine with. And then some players are going to say, why can't I do other things? We could have done this in 20 minutes. So it's something you always have to be aware of. And again, we get to the why, right? Why are we doing these things? Why does it work? Why does it not work? And what can we tweak to make it work better?
Yeah, it reminds me of, I think I've told this story before, but there was a 3rd edition adventure we played in Living Greyhawk where there was a mystery. And the idea was we were supposed to follow all these clues and do all this stuff. And I forget how it happened, but one of the guys at the table goes, no, we're not doing that. We're throwing a party. And long story short, we threw a party and invited the entire town, spent a bunch of gold on it. And we had a guy that we took under our wing and little local kid. And we showed him, here's how you really adventure. And as everybody comes in through the door to the party, we're detecting thoughts on them. And so everybody's I think we thought we were getting a doppelganger or something like that. And so everybody comes in and we're like, is everybody here? No, one person didn't come to the party. We got our villain. And we go there and sure enough, they're villaining it up and end of story. And we got that thing done in 30 minutes. And we were happy as could be, right? And the DM was like, well, that was a very clever way to tackle that. But sure.
Yeah. Detect thoughts, detect evil, paladin abilities, right? All of those things make speak with the infamous speak with dead, makes mysteries not a natural fit for a D&D adventure. Can you do it? Absolutely. Can it be done brilliantly? For sure. Is it a natural fit? No.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Along those same lines, we get Intrigue adventures mentioned. These are event-based but revolve around power struggles like guilds, crime syndicates, nobility, temple hierarchies, etc. Like an exchange of favors, a rise and fall of individuals, and diplomacy might be involved in an intrigue adventure. A prince's effort to be named heir to the throne, a courtier's ambition to sit at the queen's right hand, and a merchant's desire to open a trade route through enemy lands are the stuff of intrigue. We are told that to work, players and characters have to be invested in the outcome. It helps if they need a favor or if the plot is in the way of their goals. And then you can follow event-based procedures with two differences. The villains, you can have multiple villains or no villains. Uh, if you have no villains, you skip the villain steps 1 and 2 and instead start with the character goals and then the NPCs that they will be interacting with. If you have many villains, then you spend lots of time on steps 1 and 2, detailing all the different villains and their different plans. And then in step 5, you would decide how those villains respond to the character's actions. The PCs may foil one villain's plans while advancing another villain's plans. And yeah, all of this is pretty sound with all of the caveats that we said before.
Yeah.
For me, this is no different than any other type of adventure because you should always be focused on the character's goals. Now, in this case, the character's goals may be tricky, they may change based on information or based on certain outcomes. But for the most part, it's in a mystery, the character's goal is to find the truth. With an intrigue, the character's goal is to advance whatever goal that they happen to choose.
To me, this I think the 8-step process or whatever it is gets in the way of what this is all trying to do, and doesn't fit enough. And so I'll be curious whether the revised DMG takes this approach at all. I almost think that you just want to talk about how to make exciting adventures, and that includes digging into these genres and what to do with those genres, specific things to bring in, but give the DM the freedom to approach it however, because I don't know that there is one way to do this and that this 8-step process works. It's really more thinking about how to make things interesting, how to make the adventure interesting, the plot development interesting, the villain interesting, and how do you make an intrigue interesting to the players, right? What are the and I just bullet
Right.
point type things of what would make that a great experience and what to watch out for. Maybe that's it. Things to consider doing, things to watch out for each of these genres, and off you go.
Yep. We get a section on more on complications, which include moral quandaries, twists, and side events. There's a table and an explanation of possible quandaries where the PCs must make a hard choice, like two allies refusing to work together, so the PCs must choose the one that they are going to work with, or two allies that give conflicting advice, and the PCs must choose, losing the respect of one of those allies. Makes sense. Twists. We get a table of twists, for example, a time limit on what they need to do, or needing to cooperate with an enemy to achieve their goal. Then we get side quests, again, table of ideas that are peripheral to the main goal but may provide a benefit. And then, some of them are just sub goals, I would say, rather than real side quests. Any thoughts on that section?
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. They're fine. It's just again, I would want to. I think this could be done differently. And I hope they experiment with that in this next DMG because I think it's so. It's okay.
Yeah. It's here are ideas, but we're not going to tell you why
Hmm.
these are good ideas or how to use them and why. It's just sort of here
Yeah.
they are.
What makes for a great side quest? You didn't tell me. You gave me one paragraph and you gave me 8 examples with things like slay a specific monster. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. The next section talks about creating encounters, where we hear encounters are the individual scenes in the larger story of your adventure. First and foremost, they should be fun for the players. Very true. Straightforward objective, a connection to the overarching story, building on previous and foreshadowing what is to come next. Um, they tell you that there are 3 possible outcomes for encounters, which aren't necessarily true, but we'll go with this going forward. You can succeed, you can partly succeed, or you can fail. And the overall adventure should account for all 3 of these things. And okay, sure.
Yeah, I
Uh,
mean,
to
where does your
have
objection come from?
well, to have an encounter can mean a lot of different things. Um, so I guess the if you know what your party's goal is, then you can have all sorts of variations on success, all sorts of variations on failure, and all sorts of variations on partly success. Um, and it's good. It is good to think about those things, and the more nuanced you can be with those outcomes, the more what's the word I'm looking for? The more nuanced the story can be,
Mm-hmm.
I guess is what I'm looking for. So I like that it breaks things down and starts to explain it. But I think this is like the first step in a larger
Mm-hmm.
process.
Mm-hmm.
That's all.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what else do you have in this section for
So we
us?
have a discussion of character objectives, having clear objectives so each encounter moves the story forward and provides progress. What happens if the PCs ignore objectives? What are the consequences? That's all good. And then we get into creating a combat encounter. And the second saw that, I thought to myself, is there a section on creating a non-combat encounter? And it made me kind of flip through and go, they really don't talk about non-combat encounters or even non-combat components to a combat encounter. And I thought that was an interesting and unfortunate omission.
Mhm.
And it's kind of throughout this
Yeah.
step. Like later, we'll get into exploration stuff, but there's nothing here that, I mean, the section's called creating encounters. And I thought of this because we were doing Forge of Foes revisions, and there was a section I wrote that was very specific about what to do with combat, but I said encounters. And so one of the folks, either Mike or Scott, said, do you mean, when you say encounters, do you mean only combat? Oh, yeah, well, I got to address that and say that. And it's good to declare it, but that's a book that's teaching people how to do combat stuff. Here, when you're really saying creating encounters in the DMG, you need to account for that wide variety of things that are possible. And so I think that's a real big problem, especially in today's era where there's so much narrative play going on. Folks are trying to do so many things with D&D. It's unfortunate that it goes that wildly. But anyway, this section is really combat focused, and we go straight into combat encounter difficult of easy, medium, hard, or deadly, and we get definitions. And those definitions are kind of shocking. Like, I actually wonder if most DMs were quizzed on it, whether they'd get it right. Like, deadly is not a TPK. It could be deadly. There's a chance of deadliness for one or more PCs, and there is a risk of defeat. Medium has one or two scary moments, but no casualties. Might need healing resources. And that's probably lower than what folks would think these terms mean. I don't know that they're appropriate terms. We actually, in Forge of Foes, redefine them because I think these don't sort of really particularly work well. But it speaks to how 5th edition is so death adverse as an edition without saying that. And I think it actually, this is the book where you should say that. What do you think?
Yeah. And that goes to a big topic of mine, which is resource management.
Mm.
Right? One deadly encounter and then you get a long rest is can be scary, but is rarely scary. Give me 5 hard encounters in a row. Now we have, but before even a short rest, now we've got something to talk about. Now we are going to be in the realm of the players are going to be paying attention by that final hard encounter. So that sort of thing, I'm sure it is talked about, but needs to be overemphasized because of its importance.
Yeah, I mean, there is a section later. It talks about the adventuring day, and it says most adventuring parties can handle about 6 to 8 medium or hard encounters in a day, and there is a calculus of XP per day for each character by level. But later, Jeremy Crawford in interviews said they write all of their adventures and do all of their playtesting based on the party always being fully rested. So it's almost like they're just giving you this as a warning of, hey, if you go above this, it might be too much. But there's no real advice here as to what to do in a given day and what makes for a good. And that's where, to me, it's not about so much just the. I mean, yes, it's important to know challenge concepts, but it's the pacing of it, the story beats that come from different amounts in a day, and none of that's really addressed.
Right.
We have our encounter challenge rules here, which are, I think the rules are fine. It was easier in fourth edition. This is almost like a return to third edition in its approach. So it's a little confusing, which is why we probably see, I would guess around half of all DMs don't use this system, maybe even higher.
Mhm.
It is complex with a lot of steps and requires adding up all the XP of the monsters and determining whether you're above the total, and that's what drives a certain difficulty level. And if you have monsters in waves, you make one adjustment, or if there's more than 5 PCs or fewer than 3 PCs, you make an adjustment. There's multiple monsters, you make an adjustment. And all of that, I think, is you do need these kinds of rules, but they are very inexact because of how monsters are created and the wide variance in what we find
Mhm.
a monster can provide at a certain CR. So, and none of these rules are speaking that. It's one of the problems when you write all the books in the core, and then years later people have played it and really learned off of it. And I think hopefully in rewriting this, well, it'll be interesting to see in rewriting the DMG, do they address how the edition actually runs? Or
Mhm.
are they making enough tweaks to it that they, again, don't know how to say what to do for the edition that you're playing because they haven't seen where it is? Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, as more and diverse player options come out, the synergy of rules makes characters more powerful. Even if you're not a devout power gamer, you just by default become more powerful, which takes that math and throws it right out the window. If you could even trust it at the start, it makes it even more out of line. Um, so it's good. It was good to have that there when this book was originally released. Uh, but of course, it's now, I don't want to say irrelevant, but
Mhm.
it's, as you said, not necessarily very complete and exact.
And this is why, you have all these forum threads, Discord discussions of, I can never challenge my players. What do I do? Right? The paladin has an AC I can never hit. If I could possibly hit it, they'll shield it away. Right? You're like, what do I do? And nothing here ever addresses those kinds of situations. What to do when your party can handle everything you're throwing at them. Right? What do you do when things feel
Mhm.
boring? Any of those kinds of things that can happen to people. My players are on their phones, and I think it's a thrilling encounter. Right? Like none of that advice is
Mhm.
here. We get just things like, hey, there should be 2 short rests per day, and yeah, okay. Hmm.
Mhm. Yeah, I do like that they put like fun combat encounters, a little
Hmm.
section about things that you can throw into an encounter to switch things up to make players act in a different manner than they might otherwise. That might be optimal for them to never move and to stand in the same place and attack. So we get things like features that encourage movements, chandeliers, traps, changes in elevation, pits. Changes in elevation, they always throw that one in.
Hmm.
And for me, it never quite lives up to
Hmm.
um, its, it is it fun to put a goblin archer on a 30-foot tall pedestal that needs to be climbed? Sure, it seems like it's fun, but what happens? So the rogue uses a bonus action to dash, and they're already up there on the top of the pedestal, pushing the goblin off. Did it really add a lot of tactical? Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, not really. Now, if you make it impossible to climb, and then they need to use magic to get up there, that does make it more interesting, more tactically interesting, of course. But then if you know your party has no magic to teleport and no way to climb, no way to fly, then that just becomes a drag for those parties. So it's a tough nut to crack.
I like elevation changes, but it does take a lot of thought
Mm-hmm.
about how is someone negotiating this. What's the point? Is the point that my goblin's really hard to get to? is the point that it's fun to get to the
Right.
goblin. You know, like you had the in the intro to the Tyranny Dragons adventure, you have that hayloft, and that's a lot of fun because it's
Mhm.
like my monk got up there in a heartbeat, and I felt super cool doing it. And then another time I ran it, they set the whole place on fire, and that was trouble for the people who were up there. And just so it can be really good, right? Like those elevation changes
Yeah,
can
yeah.
lead to unexpected hijinks, and yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. So little things like that, but they don't go far enough for me, as you said, into the other pillars and
Yeah.
incorporating those other pillars, incorporating role play and exploration and those sorts of things into a combat and what that can mean. So, random encounters are a way to deliver the unexpected. They are usually presented in the form of a table. When a random encounter occurs, you roll a die and consult the table to determine what the party encounters. We are given reasons to use them, such as to create urgency, drain resources, and reinforce themes. I don't use random encounters anymore. I did when I played AD&D,
Hmm.
uh, but when I DM, I want to know a reason for an encounter, and I want to build it and tailor it to actually carry forth a theme, uh, you know, specifically. So this is all great advice that doesn't mean much to me.
Yeah, I was looking at some of the older Dungeon Masters guides, and I think those handle it best. I can't remember which one now, but one of them really talked about if you're going to do this and you're going to set up the table, here's how to really think about the probabilities. And there's a piece here, but it did it with
Mhm.
examples and gives an example to him and really talks about what the different allocations are. You know, sort of says like, you know, these are common, these are uncommon, this is rare, right? That's what you're doing with this table when you're using two dice like this.
Yep.
um or I think some of the advice of like why Rhyme of the Frost Maiden has these really great takes, right, where they do you're rolling a die, and then you're rolling a die for whether there's a blizzard, and they've arranged the table such that the blizzard can't possibly show up with certain creatures, or certain creatures won't ever show up in a blizzard, certain only show up in a blizzard, based on how they've put those rolls
Mhm.
together. And that's very clever. So I think there is some advice to be
Mhm.
given here, but I'd like more advice on how to make them fun and stand out. And because they're kind of mini encounters, and that's probably the reason you don't use them and why I don't really use them a lot, is that to make something fun, well, I might as well just design it. Yes, I can improv
Mhm.
things, but
Right.
I will have a more fun experience if I design it. And so I can create the feeling of a random encounter that I've planned, and then it ends up having neat concepts to it, which is going to make for better experience. And that's probably worth talking about too, I
Mhm.
think.
Yeah. Yep. And we get a section on, as Teo said, creating random encounter tables,
Mhm.
and random encounter challenges. Noting that they don't have to be level appropriate, but don't slaughter the party. Always good advice, or 99% of the time. They also mentioned that not all random encounters should require combat. Allow players to hide or bargain if a something shows up that is well beyond the means of the party. But most entries are intended to lead to combat, and so we get a description of what an appropriate challenge is, such as a single monster with the challenge rating equal to or lower than the party's level, which for me is called less than a speed bump, or a group of monsters whose adjusted XP value constitutes an easy, medium, or hard challenge for the party as determined using the encounter building guidelines earlier in this chapter. So, yeah,
Mhm. Yeah.
I'm
I
out of
mean,
words.
overall, I think this is one of the reasons. I think this chapter is one of the reasons we see so many DMs in fifth edition looking for answers, is because this
Mhm.
does not really serve that task that, you know, the job that the DMs want out of it, that
Mhm.
readers want out of it in today's era, to understand how to craft an adventure and encounter. Not really fulfilled by this. I don't know that it's fulfilled by any of the previous editions either. I like some pieces better than others, but they're pretty similar. The fourth edition one, I think, is really the standout. That one, as we've said before, does a really good job of covering these things, of just telling you you're going to run encounters, make it fun. Matt Colville did a video the other day on why you should DM, sort of encouraging, if you've never DM'd before and you play, here's how to do it. And it's a very, just take these ideas and run with it and build as you go. And it's the right kind of approach. And I think that's almost the kind of thing that should be here. And it's those tips that make, like, you mentioned transitions, or really one of the people asking questions in the news segment mentioned transitions, and that's a thing that's not here and wasn't in Matt Colville's video either, that I think is really important. Is how is this ending, and how is that ending leading anywhere to tie into what's coming next? And that is a really important part of encounter design. And so those are the kinds of tips I'd like to see here that I think can really transform how the experience that you create, right?
Yeah. Yeah, for me, it all comes down to the question, what do you do? Because that's what you're going to ask your players all the time. And whether you're doing an encounter or an adventure or from round to round tactics, when you ask that question, what do you do? It's generally fun to be surprised by players. But as the DM, you want to know the answer to that question before you ask. You want to know, when you ask the player, what do you do? Whether it's, what do you do at the end of this encounter that you just wrapped up? Or what do you do for your turn? Or what do you do in the middle of this role-playing encounter? You want to know, based on the information that you've given them in the encounter, in the adventure, what might possibly come next. And if you know, or if you think you know, it's because you've set it up well to start, and you have anticipated what's going to happen next. If you're surprised, great. If you like that sort of randomness and you are willing and able to run with it, you can have a lot of fun with that. But you need to know the answer to what do you do if you are going to curate the experience in a way that is most pleasing for most players.
Yeah, I mean,
and so this whole chapter needs to be, how do you set up what do you do to be answered well?
Yeah, and the general craft of it, of enjoying it, I think could be spoken to better here too, right? Because that's, to me, one of the things that draws me to this over and over again, is that I love trying to create the framework upon which a great story can be told, bringing in all those disparate factors, the ideas that are in my head, the things that I think are happening in the larger plot, the things the players are doing, that what they're looking for out of this, right? Pulling that all into the encounter format and bridging into the larger adventure. That's just, I mean, that's glorious fun, right? It's neat. It takes you back to being, like, in your, like, I don't know, watching my dad in his doing carpentry work, right? It's that kind of, here's what I'm building, and then eventually a thing exists, right? That's what crafting adventure is like. It's that kind of, get your hands in there, and it's a good feeling, and you go, well, I wasn't perfect, but boy, did I learn from that, and here's what I'm going to do next time. But to do that, you have to be able to pull back, and I think this does not do enough of that pulling back to help you understand the larger way that you're operating, and the reasons why you're doing these things, and the questions you should be asking yourself. And that might even be another thing that could be here, something like a, before you're starting, checklist of why you're even doing this, right? Getting to those questions you're asking about. And then after, how did it go? What I learned from, right? Could be a good addition to this.
Yeah. So we have found our way through chapter 3. Next week, we'll talk about chapter 4, creating non-player characters. So thank you, Teos, for your hard work and your knowledge that you've been sharing with us.
Thank you, Shawn, for your work, all the things you still remember that you've created and done.
Those 3 things I remember creating. And I want to thank all of our listeners out there. Thank you to our patrons as well. Thank you to our Master of Dungeon supporters. We get a special shout out to our Master of Realms supporters in our show notes, and the masters of our multiverse. Well, you get a special shout out right now, such as Keith Amon of the Monsters Know What They're Doing series, Craig Bailey, Steve Bissonette, Merrick Blackman, Evil John, Darren Chandler, Andy Edmonds at Nerdronomicon, Ben Heisler and Paige Lightman, Sean Hurst, Brian King, Jim Klingler at DM Prime Mover, Travis Lee, Chad Lench, Post Fiction RPG Audio, Eric Mingy, The Micro Ant, Sean Molly, Falcon Neal, Chance Russo at Drago Russo, Ross Sandberg, Krishna Simone Say, Joe Tyler, James Walton, Graham Ward. Thank you so much for your support. And thank you to all our listeners. If you are enjoying the show, please do consider supporting us on our Patreon. You can find it at patreon.com/masteringdnd. Also, if you get a chance, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or via whatever means you listen to this show. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube if you do enjoy seeing us in high def action. So, Teos, where could people find your beautiful visage?
Well, the best place to go is alphastream.org. That's where all the stuff can be found. Hopefully, there'll be a video coming out around the end of this week, I think. I'm trying to get things done while my wife's away. Sean, where do we find you?
Mm-hmm. Oh, you can find me at all the places on Twitter at Sean Merwin. The podcast is on Twitter at Mastering D&D. Also on Mastodon, you can find us. And of course, the Patreon or at our YouTube channel called Mastering Dungeons. So we now know how to create adventures and encounters thanks to the 4th or 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide. So what are we going to do now, Teos?
Oh, it's really simple. We're going to take the Greyhawk campaign setting, take all the parts that we love, strip them out, and then run an adventure that will involve everyone being polymorphed into a gnome.
Mm-hmm. We're going to call Big B Little B.
Little B.